"It hurts down there." The rancher froze and did the unthinkable Wild West stories. Life on the frontier was never easy, and every day brought new challenges. But John had learned long ago that complaining or feeling sorry for himself did nothing to change the world. He swung his legs over the edge of the rough wooden bed, feeling the cold floor beneath his boots. The chill of the morning seeped into his bones, a reminder that the West was as harsh as it was beautiful. Outside, the wind whispered through the open fields. The cattle lowed in the distance, their breath visible in the cold air. John pulled on his worn coat, the one that had kept him warm through many bitter winters, and stepped outside. His eyes scanned the horizon, taking in the rolling hills, the dry riverbed, and the line of mountains far off in the distance. Out here, a man had to rely on himself. Doctors were hours away by horseback, neighbors were few and far between, and help was never guaranteed. John had learned to be resourceful, to act quickly when problems arose, and to endure pain without complaint. His hands, rough and calloused from years of work, moved quickly as he checked on the horses. Each animal had a name, a personality, and a place in his heart. He spoke to them softly, making sure they were healthy, their hooves uninjured, their coats thick enough to withstand the cold. He fed them and gave them water from the nearby trough, always careful to do so quietly so as not to startle the herd. The animals trusted him as he trusted them, and in a world where human companionship was often scarce, that trust meant everything. After the horses, John turned his attention to the cattle. He moved among them, inspecting for injuries or illness, guiding strays back into the herd. Every year, he had learned more about the animals, reading their behavior as if it were a language only he could understand. Out here, mistakes could be costly. A sick cow left untreated could spread disease to the others. A wounded animal could attract predators. Each day demanded vigilance and care. And yet, despite the hard work, John found peace in these simple routines. There was a rhythm to ranch life, a balance between labor and observation that grounded him. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, but the wind still cut through the valley like a knife. John paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, though it was cold enough that sweat quickly froze. He looked toward the hills, where a small patch of trees marked the edge of a creek. That was his next destination. Water was life, and the creek provided not only water for his livestock, but also a place to gather firewood and hunt small game. As he walked, he thought about the years he had spent here, the seasons he had seen, the storms he had endured. Life on the frontier had shaped him into a man who could survive almost anything, but it had also taught him humility. Nature was stronger than any one person, and sometimes, no matter how skilled or prepared he was, he had to accept what came. As John reached the creek, he noticed a thin layer of ice forming along the edges of the water. Winter was coming, and with it, more hardships. He knelt and broke the ice with a rock, letting fresh water flow into his bucket. The sound was calming, a small comfort in the otherwise harsh landscape. He filled his container, then searched for firewood, breaking branches and gathering dry wood to keep his cabin warm. These small tasks, mundane to some, were essential to survival. Every piece of wood, every drop of water, every action mattered. There was no room for carelessness. While gathering firewood, John felt a sharp pang in his side. He paused, breathing heavily, trying to determine if it was muscle strain or something more serious. But after a moment, he shook it off. Life on the ranch had made him familiar with minor pains and aches, and he was confident he could handle it. He continued his work, carrying the wood back to his cabin, stacking it carefully near the hearth. The fire would need tending throughout the day, especially with the cold wind sweeping across the plains. By now, he had learned to anticipate the needs of both his home and his animals, always thinking a few steps ahead. Back at the cabin, John stoked the fire, feeling the warmth spread through the small room. He took a moment to eat breakfast, simple fare of bread and dried meat, and sipped on black coffee, strong enough to wake even the sleepiest of eyes. The cabin was modest, with rough wooden walls and a few personal belongings. Photos of family he had lost and keepsakes from days gone by filled small shelves. He looked at them and felt a mix of sadness and pride. Life here was lonely, but it had also taught him resilience, the ability to face hardships with courage and determination. As the day wore on, John worked tirelessly. He repaired fences, mended broken gates, and ensured that the cattle had enough feed. Each action required careful attention. A single mistake could result in lost livestock or injury. But John never complained. To him, this was life, hard, demanding, but rewarding in its own way. The satisfaction of a job well done, of animals healthy and safe, was a reward that no amount of money could buy. He moved with purpose, knowing that the survival of his ranch depended on his efforts. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains. John paused to admire the view. Despite the hardships, despite the cold and isolation, there was beauty here. The colors of the sunset reflected off the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. For a brief moment, all the toil and struggle felt worth it. Life on the frontier was harsh, but it was also pure and unfiltered. Every moment, every experience was real and immediate, and John cherished that authenticity more than anything else. As evening fell, John tended to the animals one last time. He ensured the cattle were settled, the horses secure in their stables, and the barn doors locked against the cold and any wandering predators. The day had been long, exhausting, but necessary. He returned to his cabin, feeling a mix of fatigue and quiet satisfaction. Life on the ranch demanded endurance, patience, and courage, and John had all three in abundance. He sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into his bones, and reflected on the day's work. Despite the challenges, he was grateful. Out here, every day was a battle, but also an opportunity to survive, to thrive, and to prove to himself that he could endure whatever the Wild West threw at him. And little did John know, this day, which began like so many others, was about to take a turn that would test his courage and strength like never before. Something was coming, an unexpected challenge that would force him to confront pain, isolation, and fear in ways he had never imagined. But John had survived storms, harsh winters, and lonely nights before. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it as he always had, with determination, resilience, and a quiet, unyielding strength. The next morning, John awoke to a sharp, icy wind blowing through the cracks of his cabin walls. The chill bit at his face as he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The sky was pale and gray, a clear sign that winter was approaching fast. He could see frost forming along the edges of the window, delicate patterns that melted under the weak morning sunlight. Despite the cold, he rose quickly and went about his usual routine. There was no time to linger when survival depended on constant work. As he stepped outside, John felt something unusual. A deep, persistent ache had begun in a sensitive part of his body. At first he ignored it, thinking it might be the result of yesterday's long day, the strain of bending, lifting, and moving heavy objects. He had endured countless scrapes, bruises, and aches over the years. A minor pain was nothing to worry about. Still, it was different this time. It was sharper, more intense, and it throbbed with every step he took. He winced but continued moving, feeding the animals and checking fences, hoping the discomfort would pass. By mid-morning, the pain had not lessened. Each movement seemed to make it worse. John paused and leaned against a fence post, breathing heavily. He had faced storms that knocked him to the ground, wild animals that threatened his herd, and lonely nights where danger could be just beyond sight. Yet this invisible enemy, pain without an obvious cause, felt like something he could not fight with sheer strength alone. He rubbed his side, trying to ease the discomfort, but it stubbornly persisted. Despite the growing concern, John knew he had no choice but to continue. His animals relied on him, and the land required constant attention. He walked to the barn, his steps careful, watching the cattle. He called out softly to them, counting heads, checking for injuries, and making sure each was accounted for. The familiar routine gave him some comfort. Even as his body ached, his mind stayed focused on practical tasks. Survival, he reminded himself, meant doing what had to be done, no matter how difficult or painful. As the hours passed, John realized that the pain was becoming more than just an annoyance. It was persistent and sharp, a deep discomfort that radiated and made simple movements difficult. He tried shifting his weight, adjusting his coat, even sitting down for a few moments to rest, but nothing helped. The rancher was used to hard work, but this was different. It was a warning, one that demanded attention. Out here, there was no room for ignoring danger. If an injury went untreated, it could quickly become life-threatening. The sun climbed higher, but the day seemed darker to John. Every step he took reminded him of the pain, and the cold wind worsened his condition. He tried to keep busy, repairing broken fences and checking the water troughs, but even small movements were exhausting. He paused frequently, leaning against wooden posts or resting on bales of hay. His mind raced with possibilities, wondering if he had somehow strained himself or if the pain was a sign of something more serious. He was no stranger to hardship, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. By early afternoon, John could no longer deny the seriousness of the situation. The pain was intense and unrelenting. He realized that seeking help was impossible. He was too far from any doctor or town, and the nearest neighbor was several hours away on horseback. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful and freeing now felt dangerous. He was alone, facing a medical emergency in the middle of the wild frontier. There was no one to call for help, no one to rely on but himself. John sat on the edge of his cabin's porch, thinking carefully. Panic could be dangerous, and he had learned long ago that staying calm was essential. He considered every option, weighing the risks and potential consequences. In his heart, he knew that whatever he did next could determine his survival. The Wild West had taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And now, he needed that courage more than ever. As evening approached, the rancher began to feel the first real signs of fatigue. His movements slowed, and every step seemed to stretch the pain further. He noticed that even sitting down provided little relief. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but the ache made eating uncomfortable. He drank only a small amount of water, fearing that moving to the creek again could worsen his condition. The world outside was quiet, the cattle settled, and the horses standing patiently in their stalls, but John's mind was far from peaceful. He was trapped in a situation that left him powerless, forced to confront the limits of his own endurance. Night fell, and the cold deepened. The wind moaned across the plains, shaking the cabin and sending chills through every corner. John wrapped himself in blankets, trying to conserve warmth, but the pain was relentless. It had reached a level that demanded action. He knew he could not ignore it any longer. He thought back to stories he had heard from other frontier men, tales of survival, quick thinking, and desperate measures taken when help was impossible. They were extreme, but he understood now why those actions were sometimes necessary. Out here, ordinary solutions were not enough. Survival required boldness and a willingness to confront challenges head-on. By the middle of the night, the rancher was struggling to maintain consciousness. The cold, combined with the pain, was taking its toll. He had to act quickly. Even in the darkest hours, John's mind worked like a well-oiled machine, calculating risks and options. He moved slowly, deliberately, preparing himself for the tasks ahead. The quiet of the night offered little comfort, only the sound of wind and the occasional low of cattle in the distance. But John had faced many dark nights before. He had survived storms, predators, and the harshest winters. He reminded himself that this was just another challenge, another test of his endurance and courage. Finally, he acknowledged the truth. He could not wait for help to arrive. It would not come in time, and inaction could cost him his life. The rancher took a deep breath, steeling himself. He recalled the old wisdom passed down from frontier families, knowledge that combined practical skills with tough survival instincts. This knowledge was sometimes uncomfortable, even frightening, but it was essential in situations where no one else could intervene. John prepared himself mentally and physically, ready to face what lay ahead with focus, determination, and an unwavering will to survive. The hours stretched endlessly, and the ache persisted, a constant reminder that the body could only endure so much before it demanded action. John's mind raced, thinking through every possibility. He remembered past injuries, past solutions, past dangers, and realized that survival often meant doing what others could not imagine. Fear was present, but it was not overwhelming. It was a tool, sharpening his senses and forcing him to consider every detail carefully. By now, John knew that the coming moments would test him in ways he had never experienced before. In the early hours of the morning, John's resolve hardened. He could not allow the pain to defeat him, could not let the isolation of the frontier claim another victim. The animals depended on him, the ranch depended on him, and most importantly, his own life depended on him. He took stock of the tools and resources available in his cabin: knives, ropes, blankets, and other basic supplies. Every item could play a role in helping him manage the situation. Every step required careful consideration because mistakes could be costly. As dawn approached, a quiet determination settled over John. The sky began to lighten, casting a pale glow over the plains. The wind continued to blow, but he felt a small sense of clarity amid the chaos of pain and fear. The rancher understood that he was about to face one of the greatest challenges of his life. It was a challenge that would require strength, skill, and courage beyond what he had previously imagined. He would have to rely on every lesson learned from years of frontier life, every moment of endurance, and every ounce of resilience he had built. With the first light of morning filtering through the windows, John took a deep breath and prepared himself for what needed to be done. The pain had reached a level that demanded immediate action, and the isolation of the frontier left him no choice. He was alone, facing a crisis that few could imagine, but he was ready. The rancher had survived storms, harsh winters, and countless dangers. This was just another test, and he would meet it with the same quiet strength and determination that had carried him through all the challenges of his life. The first light of day broke over the plains, washing the ranch in pale gold and illuminating the frost that clung to every blade of grass. John sat on the edge of his porch, wrapped in blankets, his body aching more than it ever had before. The pain had not eased overnight. If anything, it had worsened. Every shift of weight, every small movement, sent sharp reminders of how serious the situation had become. His mind was clear, though, focused on one fact. He could not wait for anyone to help him. The frontier offered no guarantees, no doctors just over the hill, no neighbors who could ride to his rescue in time. This was a man versus circumstance, and he was alone. John's thoughts wandered to the lessons he had learned over a lifetime in the West. His father had taught him that survival often meant acting when others would hesitate, making choices that were frightening but necessary. He recalled stories of men and women who had endured extreme winters, dangerous wildlife, and even injury without any hope of help. They had survived because they refused to panic, because they relied on skill, knowledge, and courage rather than luck. Now John realized he had to do the same. The pain he felt was no ordinary injury. It was a test of his endurance, intelligence, and resolve. The rancher rose slowly, testing his body with careful movements. Each step reminded him of the ache, each motion sent a shiver through him. Yet he did not give up. He moved to the barn, checking the animals once more, making sure they were settled and safe. He spoke to them quietly, even as his own discomfort dominated his thoughts. Their calmness gave him a small sense of peace, a reminder that some things in life remained steady even when everything else seemed uncertain. He thought about the day ahead and what it would demand of him. He had to act decisively, but he also had to act wisely. Mistakes here could be fatal. As he worked through the morning, John reflected on the reality of his situation. The pain was relentless, and there was no one to help him if it worsened. The nearest doctor was many miles away, and the journey would be impossible in his condition. Even if he could travel, the cold weather and rugged terrain made it dangerous. He understood now what survival meant in the most raw and unforgiving sense. It was the ability to face fear, uncertainty, and physical suffering with determination and clarity. Panic could only make things worse. Clarity could make the difference between life and death. By midday, John realized that he needed to make a plan. Sitting and waiting would achieve nothing. The pain demanded action, and action meant using every bit of knowledge and skill he had acquired over the years. He gathered supplies in his cabin: clean cloths, basic tools, water, and blankets. Every item was important, and every detail mattered. Even something as simple as a piece of cloth could serve multiple purposes: protection, comfort, or stabilization. Out here, resourcefulness was as important as courage. John reminded himself that in the wild, survival depended on preparation, foresight, and the willingness to do what was necessary, even if it was uncomfortable or frightening. The afternoon sun was high, but John hardly noticed. His thoughts were occupied with the steps he would need to take, the dangers he might face, and the strategies he could employ. He reviewed everything he had learned about handling emergencies. He remembered first aid lessons from old manuals, practical advice from other ranchers, and the intuitive understanding of his own body that only came from years of working with it in harsh conditions. Every piece of knowledge was important, and he drew upon it like a map in the dark. He had survived storms, wild animals, and hunger. He could survive this too, but it required focus and courage. John sat on a chair by the window, looking out at the expanse of land he had worked so hard to maintain. He felt a quiet sadness at the thought of what could happen if he failed. The ranch had been his life, his pride, and his companion during lonely winters. But the sadness was tempered by determination. Survival was not just about comfort or convenience, it was about life itself. He could endure pain, cold, and isolation. He had done so before, and he would do so again. What was required now was courage, a willingness to confront the unknown, to act decisively, and to rely on his knowledge and instincts when no one else could help him. By late afternoon, John's discomfort had grown to a level that made simple tasks nearly impossible. Even moving a bucket of water required careful, deliberate steps. The cold air made his muscles stiff. The ache made every motion uncomfortable, and yet he refused to succumb to despair. He knew that physical pain was temporary if addressed correctly, but inaction could make it permanent, or worse. He paused frequently, sitting on bales of hay or leaning against the cabin walls, breathing deeply and thinking through his next steps. Every detail mattered. Every small choice could affect the outcome of the day. As evening approached, John knew the moment of decision was coming. The night would bring more cold, more challenges, and more isolation. The animals were settled, the cabin was secure, and the land was quiet. The world outside seemed calm, but inside, John's mind raced with planning and preparation. He visualized every step he might need to take, considered the risks, and prepared himself mentally for what lay ahead. The Wild West had taught him that preparation was half the battle. Acting without thought was dangerous. Careful planning could save a life. Night fell and the cold intensified. John sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, but even the warmth of the flames could not fully ease his discomfort. His mind focused on the hours ahead, on the actions he would need to take to survive. Fear was present, but it did not control him. Instead, it sharpened his senses, forcing him to consider every detail carefully, to anticipate every possible obstacle. Courage, he reminded himself, was not the absence of fear. Courage was acting in spite of fear, using intelligence and skill to overcome challenges that would overwhelm the unprepared. By the middle of the night, John's resolve hardened. He would not wait. He would not hope for help that might never arrive. He had to act, and he had to act decisively. He reviewed his supplies one last time: cloths, water, blankets, and simple tools. Each item had a purpose, and each could be crucial in the coming hours. He thought through every movement he would make, every precaution he would take, and every step necessary to endure the pain and protect himself. The night was long, and the darkness outside mirrored the uncertainty he faced, but John's mind was clear, focused, and determined. The first hours of dawn brought light and a renewed sense of urgency. The rancher moved carefully around the cabin, ensuring everything was in order. The animals were safe, the land quiet, and the wind still biting at his skin. Every decision he had made up to this point had prepared him for what was coming. He felt a strange calm amid the discomfort, a quiet confidence that he could face the challenge ahead. He had survived storms, injuries, and loneliness. Now, he would survive this. It would require courage, skill, and resilience, but he was ready. John paused to take a deep breath, the cold morning air filling his lungs. He focused on steadying his mind, calming the adrenaline, and preparing for the moment that would define the day. His hands shook slightly, not from weakness but from anticipation. The pain was still present, demanding attention, and the isolation was stark. But he reminded himself that he had survived worse. He had endured hardships that would have broken others, and he had always emerged stronger. The challenge ahead would test him, but he would meet it with the same quiet strength that had carried him through every trial of his life. By mid-morning, John was ready. Every preparation, every plan, every moment of reflection had led to this point. He had considered the risks, understood the consequences, and steeled himself for the actions he would take. The world outside was quiet, the animals settled, and the cabin warm from the fire he had tended throughout the night. Everything was in place for him to act, and he did so with determination, focus, and courage. The Wild West had demanded resilience, and John had answered the call. The morning air was crisp and sharp as John moved carefully through his cabin, preparing for what he knew he had to do. The pain had reached a level that no longer allowed him to wait or hope for help. Every instinct, every lesson learned from years of frontier life, told him that the moment for action had arrived. He had spent the night planning, thinking through every movement, and considering every tool and resource available to him. Now, the time for preparation was over. There was only action and the will to survive. John gathered the supplies he had prepared: clean cloths, simple tools, water, and blankets. Every item had a purpose, and every detail could make a difference. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the soft lowing of the cattle outside. The wind howled faintly against the walls, reminding him of the isolation that surrounded him. There was no one coming to help, no townsfolk riding over the hills. It was just him, the land, and the test that life had placed before him. With deliberate care, he moved to a small table in the corner of the cabin, laying out the items he would need. He had thought through each step, visualizing the process again and again, preparing his mind as much as his hands. The fear was present, a quiet companion that kept him alert, but it did not control him. John had learned that fear could sharpen awareness and focus, but panic could destroy it. He steadied his breathing, slowing his heartbeat, and reminded himself that he had survived countless challenges in the past. This was just another test, one that required courage, patience, and careful thought. The hours passed slowly, the sunlight creeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. John worked methodically, ensuring every movement was precise. He adjusted the blankets around him, keeping his body as comfortable as possible, and checked his supplies repeatedly. Even the simplest oversight could cause serious problems, so attention to detail was critical. His body ached, but his mind remained sharp. The pain had become a companion of sorts, a reminder of why he needed to act, and a guide to the seriousness of his condition. By mid-morning, he had settled into a rhythm. Each movement was deliberate, every step calculated to minimize strain while still achieving what needed to be done. The world outside continued as usual. The cattle grazed quietly, the wind swept across the plains, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. None of it mattered except as context for the task at hand. John focused entirely on survival. He reminded himself that the frontier had always demanded resilience, ingenuity, and courage. It was not a place for hesitation. The thought of what he had to do was frightening, but he faced it with determination. He knew there was no alternative. Ignoring the situation would only make it worse, possibly even fatal. In the West, waiting for help often meant death. Every frontier tale he had ever heard, every story passed down from other ranchers and pioneers, emphasized the same truth. Survival depended on the willingness to act, even in the most uncomfortable or frightening circumstances. John had prepared for this moment, and now it had arrived. He paused for a moment to breathe deeply, feeling the cold air fill his lungs and steady his mind. The pain was constant, a sharp, insistent reminder of the urgency of the situation. Yet it also reinforced his determination. The discomfort told him that this was serious, that delay could be dangerous, and that courage and careful action were required. John's hands shook slightly, not from weakness, but from the anticipation and intensity of what lay ahead. He reminded himself that he had endured storms, loneliness, and harsh winters. He had faced danger countless times. This, too, was something he could endure. Time seemed to stretch as he worked. Every motion was slow, careful, and deliberate. The rancher reminded himself to remain calm, to focus on methodical action rather than emotion. The night had been long, filled with planning and mental preparation. The morning light now brought clarity, allowing him to approach the task step by step. He had learned that survival in the West was rarely about heroics. It was about careful thought, preparation, and controlled action. Bravery was not reckless, it was deliberate, guided by knowledge and experience. As the day moved forward, John's focus intensified. He was entirely aware of his surroundings, the cabin walls, the tools at hand, the sound of the wind, the low hum of the animals outside. Each detail mattered. Each step he had visualized in his planning had a purpose. He moved steadily, maintaining his calm and focus, and reminding himself repeatedly that hesitation could be dangerous. The hours passed, and the task before him demanded every ounce of his attention. There was no room for distraction. Survival required complete commitment. By early afternoon, John had completed the preliminary steps. He had organized his tools, positioned the blankets and cloths, and ensured that everything he might need was within reach. His movements were efficient, precise, and deliberate. He had minimized unnecessary strain on his body while preparing for the critical actions that lay ahead. The wind outside continued to blow, but he barely noticed it now. His focus was absolute. He had faced many challenges in his life, but this one required him to act alone, relying entirely on his own knowledge, courage, and careful preparation. The sun was high in the sky, casting strong light across the cabin, but John barely felt its warmth. His attention was on the task, his mind on survival, his determination unwavering. He reminded himself that the Wild West had always demanded toughness, resourcefulness, and courage. This situation, though extreme, was not entirely unfamiliar. It was simply another challenge, another test of endurance. He had survived other trials and he could survive this. The key was patience, focus, and deliberate action. John paused to take another deep breath. His body ached, but the ache was not an enemy. It was a signal, a reminder of why he needed to act carefully. Every sensation, every discomfort guided him toward precision and focus. The isolation of the frontier, which had seemed peaceful at times, now emphasized the seriousness of the moment. There was no one to call for help, no one to rely on. Survival depended entirely on him. Every step, every decision, every movement mattered. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as he continued his preparations. He reviewed the steps he had planned again and again, visualizing each motion and imagining possible complications. The process required concentration, courage, and patience. He reminded himself that the Wild West was unforgiving, but it had also taught him resilience. Each challenge, each hardship, each difficult decision had built the skills and mental strength he now relied upon. He was ready. By late afternoon, John had completed all preparations. Everything was in place for him to act. He felt a strange mixture of fear and determination, an acknowledgement of the difficulty of what lay ahead combined with confidence in his ability to manage it. The wind continued to sweep across the plains, but he no longer noticed it. His focus was internal, his mind sharp, and his determination absolute. The rancher had faced countless hardships, but this was the ultimate test of his endurance, courage, and survival skills. Finally, John took a deep, steadying breath and began the critical action he had prepared for. Every movement was deliberate, every step cautious, every decision guided by careful thought and experience. He reminded himself repeatedly to stay calm, focused, and precise. Fear was present, but it did not control him. He had survived storms, harsh winters, and injuries before. Now he would survive this. The frontier had demanded courage, and he was meeting the challenge head-on. The hours passed with slow, careful precision. John moved through the steps he had planned, relying on his knowledge, skill, and mental focus. The pain was still there, but it no longer dominated his attention. Instead, it was a guide, a signal of what needed to be done and why. The rancher worked methodically, maintaining calm and control despite discomfort and isolation. He reminded himself that survival was about careful, deliberate action, not recklessness or panic. By evening, the immediate challenge was behind him. John was exhausted, his body sore, but he had completed what he needed to do. The fire in the cabin crackled warmly, the animals were safe, and the wind had softened slightly. He sat back, taking deep breaths, and allowed himself a moment of relief. The frontier had tested him once again, and he had endured. The day had demanded courage, focus, and resilience, and he had delivered all three. He had faced an unimaginable challenge and emerged with his life intact. The morning light crept softly into John's cabin, casting warm, golden rays across the rough wooden floor. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of quiet calm. The pain, though still present, had eased considerably. The actions he had taken the previous day had allowed him to survive what could have been a truly dangerous situation. He sat by the fire, feeling its warmth seep slowly into his aching bones, and allowed himself to reflect on what had happened. The experience had been frightening, exhausting, and humbling, but it had also revealed a strength he had not fully recognized in himself. John's thoughts wandered over the past few days, the cold mornings, the endless work tending to the ranch, and the intense pain that had forced him into action. He realized how much he had taken his life on the frontier for granted. The isolation, the harsh weather, and the distance from any help had made him feel vulnerable in ways he had rarely experienced before. And yet, he had survived. He had faced the challenge head-on, relying on his own skill, knowledge, and determination. The relief he felt was deep and profound. It was the relief of someone who had faced the unknown and emerged victorious, though changed. The animals stirred in the barn, their lowing, and the rustle of hooves reminding John of the life he had to care for. He rose slowly, testing his body with cautious movements. Each step was deliberate, each motion calculated to avoid strain. The pain was still a reminder of the ordeal he had endured, but it no longer held him captive. He felt a quiet sense of triumph. Survival had required courage, patience, and intelligence, and he had used all three to endure a challenge that would have overwhelmed a less prepared man. As he fed the animals and checked on the fences, John reflected on the lessons of the experience. Life on the frontier had always been unpredictable, demanding, and sometimes harsh beyond reason. Yet, it had also taught him resilience, self-reliance, and the importance of preparation. He had survived storms, wild animals, and lonely winters, but this experience had shown him something new, the depth of his own inner strength. Even in moments of extreme discomfort and isolation, he had remained focused, calm, and determined. He had faced fear directly and acted wisely, proving to himself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. By mid-morning, John had completed the routine tasks of the ranch with careful attention. Every movement was slower than usual, every decision more deliberate, but the satisfaction of accomplishment was immense. The fences were secure, the animals fed, and the barn tidied. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling, and the world outside calm. The rancher took a moment to sit by the window, watching the wind sweep across the plains. The landscape was beautiful, even in its harshness, and he felt gratitude for the life he had chosen, a life that required courage, demanded hard work, and rewarded perseverance. John thought about how he had managed the crisis. He recognized that his survival had depended on a combination of preparation, knowledge, and careful action. The experience had tested him in ways that were both physical and mental, forcing him to confront fear, uncertainty, and pain simultaneously. He understood now that true strength was not simply physical toughness, but the ability to remain calm, think clearly, and act decisively under pressure. The frontier had taught him many lessons, but this one was perhaps the most valuable, that human resilience could surpass even the most difficult circumstances when guided by reason, courage, and determination. As the day wore on, John began to focus on recovery. He tended to his own needs with as much care as he gave to the ranch. He drank water slowly, ate simple food, and rested whenever possible. Each small action was a step toward regaining strength and ensuring he could continue his work. He understood that survival was not just about facing immediate danger, but also about taking care of oneself afterward. Recovery required patience, attention, and self-discipline, and he approached it with the same seriousness he had applied to the crisis itself. The afternoon passed quietly. John spent time repairing small items around the cabin, ensuring that everything was in order. He reflected on the importance of preparation and foresight. The tools, knowledge, and experience he had relied upon had been the difference between life and death. He considered the value of every small detail, every precaution, and every lesson he had learned over years of ranching. Each had contributed to his survival, and he felt gratitude for the knowledge passed down to him by family, neighbors, and fellow ranchers. By evening, the rancher felt a renewed sense of appreciation for life itself. The pain, though still present, no longer dominated his thoughts. Instead, he focused on the simple pleasures that made the hardships of frontier life worthwhile. The warmth of a fire, the quiet companionship of animals, and the vast beauty of the land. He recognized that the experience had changed him, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that strengthened his understanding of resilience, courage, and the value of careful, deliberate action. As night fell, John sat by the fire, reflecting on the future. The ordeal had been a stark reminder of the realities of life on the frontier: isolation, unpredictability, and the necessity of self-reliance. Yet it had also reinforced the strengths he possessed: intelligence, courage, and determination. He thought about the challenges he would face in the coming seasons, and he felt ready. The experience had deepened his understanding of himself and the world around him, giving him confidence that he could endure whatever lay ahead. Sleep came slowly that night. John lay in his bed, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional lowing of cattle. His body was tired, his muscles sore, but his mind was calm. He reflected on the lessons of survival, on the value of preparation, and on the importance of courage in the face of fear. The frontier had tested him once again, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident in his own abilities. He understood now that every challenge, no matter how frightening or uncomfortable, could be faced and overcome with careful thought, determination, and resilience. Over the following days, John continued to recover physically and mentally. He resumed his work on the ranch gradually, pacing himself and taking care to avoid overexertion. Every task, from feeding the animals to repairing fences, became an opportunity to reaffirm his strength and resilience. The pain that had threatened him gradually faded, leaving behind a sense of accomplishment and quiet pride. He knew that he had faced a situation that could have overwhelmed many men, and he had survived through courage, preparation, and careful action. In the weeks that followed, John's story became a quiet legend among the few neighbors and fellow ranchers who knew him. He rarely spoke of the ordeal in detail, but those who witnessed his resilience understood the depth of his courage. The experience left him with a renewed appreciation for the simple routines of frontier life, the importance of self-reliance, and the value of knowledge, preparation, and patience. He recognized that life could be harsh and unpredictable, but it could also be rewarding and beautiful when approached with courage and careful thought. John often sat by the porch at sunset, watching the sun dip behind the distant hills. The plains stretched endlessly before him, a vast expanse of life, work, and opportunity. He reflected on the journey he had just endured, on the fear he had faced, and the courage he had discovered within himself. Survival, he realized, was not simply about enduring hardship. It was about understanding one's limits, acting decisively when necessary, and finding strength in the face of uncertainty. It was about resilience, determination, and the quiet courage that allowed a man to confront the impossible and emerge stronger. As the years went by, John continued to live and work on his ranch, carrying the lessons of that critical experience with him. He remained a man of quiet strength, resilience, and determination, respected by neighbors and remembered by those who knew the story. He understood that the frontier could be unforgiving, but it had also taught him one of the most valuable lessons of all. The human spirit, when guided by knowledge, courage, and careful action, could endure nearly anything. Even in solitude, even in the harshest conditions, John's life became a testament to the resilience of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The experience had left him changed, stronger, and wiser, but it had not diminished his spirit. Instead, it had given him a deeper appreciation for life, for the beauty of the land, and for the quiet strength that lay within him. The rancher knew that challenges would come again, as they always did in the West, but he also knew that he had the courage, skill, and determination to face them and survive.